thank you for coming. I want to acknowledge the unceded sovereignty of the traditional owners of this land. And I want to talk to you about the food system. Because if we're interested in the food system of tomorrow, then I think that it's worth understanding how we got here. And part of that story is a story, I mean, we should know that there are some stylized facts that are important about the food system. For example, that after decades of progress in reducing the number of humans and the percentage of humans who are malnourished, we turned a corner, and the number is going up. And it's going up because of conflict, because of climate change, and because of the way the food system is structured. And so what I'd like to do is, with a presentation behind me that hopefully will come on any second now, I would like to get, there we are, look, I wanted to sort of present you with a couple of paradoxes and then give you the means to think through them. So the first paradox that I'm excited to point out, as soon as I get my clicker working, my God, I'm so incompetent, is a fact about the food system and about food system companies that I learned from the head of sustainability at Nestle. And he said, you should read this. It's a report by KPMG. It's called Expect the Unexpected, Building Business Value in a Changing World. I do not recommend you read this report. But I do recommend that you have a look at this. There's a graph that is super interesting here. And what KPMG did was say, look, let's take the big players in every industry and then let's figure out what their ecological footprint is. How much pollution are they causing? And for almost every industry, look, oil and gas over there, $670 billion in revenue, and 23% of that is the environmental footprint. But the food industry is different. Food industry is very strange, and this is taking the largest publicly available data on firms in the food industry, and you've got $89 billion of revenue, but the environmental damage caused by the food system is 224% of revenue. Now, what that means is that if you were to buy a Kit Kat, in order to undo the damage, the ecological damage of that Kit Kat, you'd need to buy two and a quarter more. And that's not something that we can get our way out of by sort of sustainable consumption. It doesn't matter what it says on the side of the Kit Kat, because the data suggests that the way the food system is structured itself is geared towards taking shortcuts and to externalizing environmental costs and social costs in ways that are deeply destructive. And I wanted to help us think about this by going not into the sort of minutiae of these corporations, but instead by asking you a question. Have a look at this, the statement here. When jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women. When jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women. Can you raise your hands if you agree with this statement? There's a brave soul at the back. Splendid. So this was a question that was asked in something called the World Values Survey. And in Sweden, 2% of respondents said, yes, they agree. In the United States, it's 5.7%. In India, 52%. And in Egypt, 99.6%. Now, hang on. Before you judge, imagine that you're living in a sexist society. I mean, we're Australia, you don't have to imagine hard. But imagine if you are also incredibly poor. And as a family, you decide that what you really want is some money. And you have a choice between a low-paying woman's job and a high-paying man's job. Then you'll take the man job. It's rational for everyone to want the high-paying job. Even though everyone loathes sexism, you go for the high-paying job. Because of poverty, because that's the situation on the ground. So let's see if we can strip poverty out of the data. And some economists tried to do that, and they crunched quite a lot of data. And they found that once you take poverty out of the equation, there are other reasons why some societies are more sexist than others. And they asked themselves, well, what are those reasons? Why do we have societies like this? I mean, is it, for example, a resource curse, the presence or absence of oil? Think of societies that are archetypically sexist. Is it because they have resources under the ground and somehow this relates to who controls the resources and it shores up the patriarchy? Maybe it's a story about religion. Oh, let's not do that. My God, we've managed to go through the entire presentation. I'm so sorry about that. And you've got to see Trump as well, which is, there we are. Let's see if we can do this without me quivering and pressing the wrong button on this thing. Here we are. So let's go back. So is religion a reason why we would have sexism in one place rather than another? Or underwear advertising? Or just something about the mainstream media? Or, obviously you can see what the next letter is going to be. And is the reason that there is sexism in the world because of Plows? And of course, that's the answer. The reason that we have, the reason that economists, and this is the gold standard journal for economics, the Quarterly Journal. What the economists found was that when you have 200 years of data and you strip out the income factor, the thing that was most closely correlated with sexism was the presence or absence of a tradition of plowing. Why? What is it about plows that makes societies sexist? Well, luckily, there is a picture that demonstrates this rather well, and I want to show it to you now. It's a picture by Thomas Gainsborough. And this is a 1750 portrait of Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. And we're going to study this just for a quick second, because this has in it everything that is the modern food system. And to see that, let's have a look at Mr. Andrews. There he is, in his hunting gear. And you'll notice that he's very, very relaxed. He really doesn't give a crap. He only has one button done up, which is incredibly, portraits are not usually done that way. And it's a sign of quite how much he doesn't give a shit. But he's got his adoring dog, he's got a gun, and he should be relaxed. All of this is his, all this property, including this fabulous stand of wheat. You can see that the workers who have tended that wheat are disposable. They're not in the picture. But the fruits of their labor are. And you'll see the nice, neat rows of wheat put there, of course, using a plow. And possibly, the seeds planted using a seed drill invented by Jethro Tull. And it's just important that you know that that's a thing. But if you look here, you've got a modern agricultural system. You've got monoculture, you've got technology, and you've got private property and then the application of labor to do some of the dirty work and then to be ushered away because you don't really want to see those people. But you also have a history in the background. In the background here, you can see where the sheep are. What was once an area called the Commons. Now, the Commons was an area where, under feudalism, under the system that came before capitalism, an area where peasants were able to survive by managing the commons together. Today we often hear of the tragedy of the commons. But back in the day, the commons was actually a resource that was thriving and that allowed peasants to survive. In particular, it allowed women to dairy, to maintain an income by managing cattle and by managing a dairy herd. But under the system that came after feudalism, that land was privatized. It was fenced. It was enclosed. And with no place to run the cattle, what you have is a decline in women's wages compared to men's wages. And you can start seeing this story of inequality, and of gender inequality in particular, emerging at the same moment as you have the modern food system being developed. So that's how a plow is linked to sexism, because it's a story about gender roles. It's a story about relationships that humans have to the land, and who can own the land and who can't, and who can work on it and who doesn't belong in the picture. And so the modern food system is stitched together by these bonds that are not just about farm to fork, but it's about power. It's about who gets to be in control. And if you want to see that, let's just have a look at Mrs. Andrews, because she is clearly not in the same, she's not represented in the same way as her husband. Look at her, she's bolt upright. She's wearing this fabulous silk dress. She is not comfortable in the outdoors in the same way that her husband is. And there's a really interesting unfinished bit of this canvas. And the speculation is that either it would have been finished with a bird shot by her husband using his gun and brought to him by his dog, or it would have been a place where a baby Andrews, a son, would have been painted in. But again, it would have been a representation of a way in which her role was all the time subservient to her husband. And in every way that matters, he controls the land and is powerful over it, not just in ways that are similar to his domination of his wife. And so you have this idea of patriarchy and a certain kind of agriculture and a certain kind of technology all bound together. And you may think, well, all right, Raj, that's fine, but what has that got to do with us today? Well, the idea of food and patriarchy and power and a certain amount of violence is au courant. I just want to show this by playing you a video of something that was, well, I'll let the video speak for itself.
What's more American than a cheeseburger? This cheeseburger, loaded with a hot dog and potato chips. In the hands of all-American model Samantha Hoops. In a hot tub. In a pickup truck, driven by an American bull rider. On an aircraft carrier. Under the gaze of Lady Liberty. As she admires the most American thick burger. With a split hot dog and kettle-cooked potato chips on a fresh-baked bun. New at Carl's Jr.
Yeah, when I show that in Europe, people think I made it up. But it's just a way of saying, look, when we think about the food system, you can't just think about the journey from farm to fork. You have to think about the history that made it possible, particularly if we're thinking about the food system of tomorrow. And if we are thinking about the food system of tomorrow, what does it look like? Well, what's the opposite of this? I would suggest that in fact, it might look a little bit like this. This is Jean-François Millet's 1857 painting called Les Glaneurs, the Gleaners. And what you have here is a painting that caused a riot when it was first shown in Paris. There were protests about this painting. Well, why? In part because look at who's front and center. It's not anyone rich. It's women working who are represented with dignity. They're not being looked down upon. And also, if you have a look over there in the corner, the man who owns everything sitting on his horse is insignificant. He doesn't matter. But what matters is the labor that's happening in front of him, using the idea of gleaning, as you may be familiar with, the idea of gleaning, of being able to take leftovers, to be able to survive on things that are the residue of commercial capitalism. That idea is actually a feudal idea. It's one of the arts of commoning, of being on the commons together. And it matters now. It matters now not just because I quite like this painting, which I do, but because if we're interested in thinking about, well, what happens next in our food system, the idea of gleaning is tremendously important, and the ideas of commoning are tremendously important. And what I want to do is very quickly just share a couple of examples of that. Because I have been doing this work in northern Malawi, this slide is redundant, obviously, because you know where Malawi is. But just in case, it's the red one. Northern Malawi is characterized by a range of things. Particularly when I first started doing some research there with my colleague Rachel Besner-Kerr, the situation was fairly dire. Child stunting, which is the privation of nutrients so bad that children are damaged for the rest of their lives. Child stunting was above 50%. People were living on less than 50 cents a day, and the HIV/AIDS epidemic had cut a swath through the population. And in northern Malawi, there were activists, there were farmers, there were nurses who said, look, we know why children are malnourished. It's because they're eating just one thing. They're eating corn. They're eating just a single crop. So what we need is biodiversity. And since the government wasn't ready to fund this kind of action, the farmers themselves, together with some colleagues, started becoming scientists. They transformed themselves into not just one thing, but everything. They became inquirers into what it is that you can use to build the soil. And what they did was reimagine a very traditional food system, a growing system that looks a bit like this. This is the milpa system from Central America, where you grow corn and beans and squash. And this way they were able to increase nutrition, increase protein by 50%. And it's a fantastic system because instead of needing fertilizer, the beans are nitrogen-fixing crops, like they help build the soil. The corn is, of course, the thing you want, and the beans creep up on the corn. And then the squash have big, fat, shady leaves that stop the weeds coming in, and then, of course, you get squash, and you get squash blossom, and you attract beneficial insects. It's a really amazing, robust food system and a way of growing things. And then the farmers said, well, look, it's no good us having terrific amounts of food. We need to make sure that people are eating it. What's stopping people eating? Well, actually, the inequality in the home. We need to, it's domestic violence. It's the fact that men aren't doing the cooking. And this kind of agriculture needs more work. Right? To be able to do this, you need to spend more time in the field. But if women are harvesting and they are cooking and cleaning and fetching firewood and breastfeeding, and there's more harvesting to do and the expectations of cooking and cleaning aren't going away, then breastfeeding can suffer. And so you have the paradox of a system that produces more food, better food, more nutritious food, and because of sexism, it means that actually there's not enough time to breastfeed and children can do worse, even if there's better food right in the household. So how do you fix that? Well, they were like, well, we've got to fight patriarchy. We've got to get the men to cook. How do you do that? How do you get men to cook? I mean, give them a grill. They experimented. They tried lots of different ways of getting men to cook. And in the end, they gamified the process. They got men and women and children all together to have a cooking contest. And this social activity transformed the way that men saw the possibilities of themselves in this just in a daily, an event that lasted more than, not more than 4 or 5 hours. But all of a sudden, it was 4 or 5 hours of tasting what the future might be, where people were equal, where men could be taught by women, where women could call men out on our shit. And for a little while, it was glorious. And then they follow up with hard organizing to help normalize men doing the cooking and not being asses. And then it takes a while to erase patriarchy from a society, but not as long as you'd think. Because over the course of 7 years, we've been filming on this documentary project. And you'll be able to see next year that actually the men in this community have utterly transformed. They're now doing the cooking and the cleaning and the childcare and the washing up and everything that they're in every way equal partners. And that's had tangible effects. I just want to show some data. I mean, while the rates of under-5 stunting in Malawi are still very high, in the community where this has been taking place, the number of malnourished children has fallen off to the extent that there's no data after 2014 because they closed the clinic. The number of hungry children in this particular part of poverty-stricken Africa was brought to 0. And so if you're interested in how are we going to feed Africa, here's an example where Malawians have themselves figured it out. And there's an important lesson for us here. And the lesson is this: it's to connect the dots with justice. And let me explain that. Because the idea here is that they didn't just do soil fertility. They didn't just do eating a bit more protein. They didn't just do, we should probably try and tackle domestic violence. And they didn't just do, let's see if we can get men to help out at the water fountain. Instead, they did it all together. But the way that they made this massive transformation in their society of ending hunger and ending gender inequality and tackling domestic violence and improving nutritional outcomes and increasing child and household welfare was not to split it up, but to bundle it and do it so that everyone saw that the most powerful were the people who were giving the most up. Right? This is a story that's about massive social transformation, but it only works because everyone can see that the men are giving up power Otherwise, there's no buy-in. It only works because you can see that the most powerful are targeted. They're not immune to this transformation. And that's really important if we think about the future of the food system, about tomorrow. Because there are food systems, and there are plans to tackle the climate change crisis. There are plans to tackle gender inequality and histories of racism. There are plans to manage our profligate use of energy. There are plans to be able to reforest the planet and bring back biodiversity loss. But those plans will only work if we do the same thing, if we connect the dots together using justice. If the rich get to evade the plans for a future food system, then none of us will want to do it. But that's the vision of something like a Green New Deal. And in the United States, what's very exciting is that we are seeing a movement for the future of the food system to be around something like the Green New Deal. And there are a lot of farmers and ranchers, 10,000 in fact, who just signed a sort of visionary call for the Green New Deal to transform agriculture and to make the food system great again, but not that. But to transform the food system in ways that are about justice. In a way that makes sure that we can all eat sustainably, that we can all eat organically, we can all find the right foods on our plate, and nobody gets to escape that justice because they get to buy their way out of it. And that vision is something I think more and more people can get behind, and we're seeing it in the United States. And that's a vision that I'm very excited to be talking now with Madonna and Patrice to discuss more how that matters here in Australia and how that might matter as a planet when we confront the climate crisis. But for now, thank you very much for surviving this presentation and for your attention. Thank you.